Welcome to our channel. If you want to learn English through stories and enjoy listening to interesting and meaningful stories that not only entertain but also teach valuable life lessons, you are in the right place. We bring you inspiring stories every day that will make you think and reflect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an exciting new story. We are here to fill your day with positivity and wisdom through the power of storytelling. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. Let's begin the story. The Honest Woodcutter. Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a poor woodcutter named Jack. Jack lived alone in a small, modest house at the edge of a large forest. His life was simple, but he was happy. Every day, he woke up early in the morning, took his axe, and went into the forest to chop wood. Jack would spend the entire day cutting down trees, chopping them into logs, and then selling the wood in the village. It was hard work, but Jack loved it. His axe was his most important tool. He had only one. It was old and rusty, but it worked well. Without his axe, Jack could not do his job. It was his only way to earn a living. He worked hard to take care of himself and the small house where he lived. Although Jack did not have much money, he was content. He was a kind and honest man, and that made him happy. One bright and sunny morning, Jack woke up early, just like every other day. He ate a simple breakfast, put on his old boots, and grabbed his axe. He walked to the edge of the forest. The birds were singing, and the sun was shining through the trees. It was a beautiful day. Jack felt good. He had a lot of work to do. As he walked deeper into the forest, he admired the tall, strong trees that surrounded him. Some of them were hundreds of years old. The forest was full of life. Jack could hear the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. Jack reached his favorite spot by the river. This was where he liked to work. The river was calm and clear, and the trees around it were tall and straight. It was the perfect place to chop wood. Jack started by picking a large tree. He took his axe and began to chop. The sound of the axe hitting the tree echoed through the forest. Jack swung the axe carefully, striking the tree with all his strength. The tree began to shake with each strike. Jack was focused on his work, his arms strong and steady. But then, something unexpected happened. As Jack swung his axe, it slipped from his hand. The axe flew through the air and landed in the river with a loud splash. Jack froze. He stared at the river in disbelief. His only axe had fallen into the deep water. The current was strong, and the river was much deeper than it looked. Jack knew he could not swim. His heart sank as he watched the axe sink lower and lower into the river. Jack was shocked and worried. Without his axe, he would have no way to earn money. He could not work, and he had no other tools. His heart was heavy with sadness. He sat down on the bank of the river, feeling hopeless. How could he work without his axe? What would he do now? As Jack sat there, feeling sorry for himself, he suddenly heard a soft voice. He looked up and saw a bright light in the distance. The light grew brighter and brighter until it appeared before him. Out of the light, a kind fairy floated down. She was beautiful, with sparkling wings and a warm smile on her face. Jack was surprised and wondered if he was dreaming. The fairy gently landed beside Jack and asked, "Why are you crying, kind woodcutter?" Jack was amazed. He looked at the fairy and explained what had happened. "I lost my axe in the river. It is the only tool I have. Without it, I cannot work. I do not know what to do. I am very sad." The fairy listened carefully. She could see the worry in Jack's eyes. After a moment of silence, she smiled and said, "Don't worry, kind woodcutter. I can help you. I will find your axe." Jack was surprised. "You can find my axe?" he asked. The fairy nodded. "Yes, I can. Just wait here and I will dive into the river. I will find your axe." With that, the fairy waved her hand, and before Jack could say anything, she flew into the air. She soared above the river, and then she dived gracefully into the water. Jack sat on the bank and waited, watching the river. He was anxious. He hoped the fairy could find his axe. Minutes passed, and Jack grew nervous. He wondered if the fairy would be able to find the axe, or if it had already sunk too deep. He could not see anything happening in the water, but he continued to wait. After what felt like a long time, the fairy reappeared from the river. She was holding something in her hand. Jack could hardly believe his eyes when he saw what the fairy was holding. It was a golden axe. The axe shone brightly in the sunlight, and it looked beautiful. The fairy smiled and asked, "Is this your axe?" Jack stared at the golden axe. It was a magnificent axe, but it was not his. It was much more beautiful than his old iron axe. Jack shook his head and said, "No, that is not my axe. My axe is an old, rusty one. It is not golden." The fairy nodded and said, "I understand." She then flew back into the air and dove into the river again. Jack sat quietly, waiting. He wondered if the fairy would return with his old axe. After a short while, the fairy came back up from the water. This time, she was holding a silver axe. The silver axe was even more beautiful than the golden one. It shone like the moon in the sunlight. The fairy asked, "Is this your axe?" Jack looked at the silver axe. It was sparkling and looked very valuable, but it was still not his. Jack smiled kindly and said, "No, that is not my axe either. My axe is an old iron axe. It is not shiny like that." The fairy smiled back at Jack. "I see," she said. "I will try one more time. Please wait here." Jack was starting to lose hope. The golden and silver axes were so beautiful. He thought that the fairy might not be able to find his old axe. But he continued to trust the fairy. He believed that she would keep her promise. Once again, the fairy flew into the river. This time, Jack was more patient. He watched the river carefully. He hoped the fairy would find his old axe, the one he had lost. After a little while, the fairy appeared again. She was holding Jack's old iron axe in her hands. It was worn and rusty, but it was still the axe Jack had lost. Jack recognized it immediately. His face lit up with joy. The fairy smiled at Jack and asked, "Is this your axe?" Jack jumped up and said, "Yes, that is my axe." "Thank you so much, fairy. You found it." The fairy smiled warmly and said, "I see that you are an honest man. Many people would have kept the golden or silver axes. But you did not. You told the truth. Because of your honesty, I will give you all 3 axes." Jack was shocked. He could not believe what the fairy was saying. "You will give me the golden and silver axes?" he asked. The fairy nodded. "Yes. You have shown that you are a man of honor. Because of your honesty, I will give you the golden axe, the silver axe, and your old iron axe." Jack was amazed. He had never imagined something like this. He thanked the fairy and took all 3 axes. He could hardly believe his good fortune. But more than the axes, Jack was grateful for the lesson the fairy had taught him. The fairy smiled and said, "Remember, Jack, honesty is always the best choice. It will always bring good things. It may not always be easy, but it is the right thing to do." Jack nodded and thanked the fairy once more. He promised to always be honest. The fairy smiled and disappeared into the sky. From that day on, Jack continued his work as a woodcutter. He used the 3 axes, but he never forgot the lesson the fairy had taught him. He became known as the honest woodcutter. People in the village respected him for his honesty and kindness. He was happy, not because of the axes, but because of the good choices he made every day. Jack lived a long and peaceful life. He always remembered that honesty was the best choice. And whenever he saw someone in need, he would help them without asking for anything in return. Jack knew that, in the end, it was the good deeds and honesty that made life worth living. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's story and found it meaningful. If you learned something new or were inspired, make sure to like this video and share it with your friends. We love bringing you fresh, exciting stories every day to brighten your day and spark your imagination. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'll be back with more amazing stories for you. Until then, stay inspiring and keep learning. See you in the next video.